are, of course, taking a break from our study of Abraham to celebrate an important day with the International Salvation Army. Another cool thing is today, Salvation Armies from around the world are celebrating International Day of Children and Youth. Isn't that great? That armies from around the world are celebrating this day. We believe that growing children up in the church is important, and we believe that they are not just our future, but that you all are full believers today. You're not like, even though we might call you junior soldiers, you're not junior believers, right? You are full believers in your own right, just as capable as any adult of building the kingdom of God. And the theme for this year, of course, is grow. And we're focusing, as Diane shared with us, on the parable of the mustard seed, which Jesus tells in Matthew chapter 13. So the previous chapter of Matthew, Matthew chapter 12, is a turning point in the Gospel of Matthew. That is where, by Matthew chapter 12, the religious leaders have given up on Jesus. They're like, oh yeah, this guy is not going to do what we want him to do. And so the religious leaders have given up on Jesus. At the end of Matthew chapter 12, Jesus's mom and brother show up to basically be like, son, come home, stop this crazy Messiah stuff, right? And what does Jesus say to them? Like, my place is with my followers. My family is my followers. And so even by the end of chapter 12 of Matthew, Jesus's family is no longer really there with him. So by Matthew 13, Jesus is focused on these followers of his, the disciples, who, it should be noted, especially today, were young men. Perhaps most of them were between the ages of 15 and 25. Perhaps we suspect most of them were under the age of 20. And the reason we do that is from Matthew 17, when they have to pay the temple tax. And Jesus says to Peter, oh, yeah, you go and get temple tax from the mouth of a fish. This is a great story. I've never preached on this story. I should probably try to do a sermon on this one day, right? But Jesus says, Peter's like, hey, Jesus, we don't have the money to pay the temple tax. And Jesus is like, oh, well, go catch a fish. You'll find the money in the mouth of the fish. It's a great story, isn't it? And what Jesus says is to pay the tax for you and I, right? For Peter and Jesus, which means only two guys perhaps had to pay the tax. The tax only had to be paid by men who were 20 and over. So we make an assumption that there's no Bible passage that says, and John was, but we make an assumption that the other disciples at that time were less than 20. So they were young guys. In fact, in Jewish culture, around 15 is when you would find a teacher. And so these guys were young guys who were finding a teacher. That's what the disciples were. And one of the ways that Jesus teaches these young guys is with parables. Jesus taught them in parables to help his listeners understand his teachings better. Unfortunately, you and I, we don't always get parables really well. One of the first mistakes that we make when it comes to parables is that we believe that these stories are biographical or real, and they're just stories. And while they speak of familiar things and teach truth, we know, for instance, there's no guy who goes out in the middle of the night for bread, like in Luke chapter 11. It's a ridiculous story, right? None of you are going to wake up at 3 a.m. this morning tonight and go, I feel like some bread. I wonder if Lulu's is open, right? None of you are going to do that. Or worse yet, like the guy in Jesus' story, go to your neighbor and say, hey, you got any bread? It's 3 a.m. I'd like some bread, right? But that's the story Jesus tells. It's a story that he tells to teach an important lesson. Closer to the thing that we're talking about today, for instance, there's no such thing as a mustard tree. There's not. You'll never find a mustard tree. Mustard plants can grow to be kind of like shrubs. They could be like 10 or maybe 15 feet at most tall, but they're not going to be a tree. Although that would be this is an artist rendition of a mustard tree. It'd be kind of cool, wouldn't it? Mustard, and of course, small birds will sometimes come and be in the branches of the mustard shrub. But if you plant a mustard seed expecting it to be like an oak tree or a big palm tree, it's not going to happen. You're not going to get that, which might be one of the points I think Jesus is trying to make, that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that one plants expecting a bush, but instead gets a tree. In fact, this little mustard seed does a whole lot of things that gardeners probably wishes that it did not. As someone who likes to garden, I can tell you from personal experience, no one wants birds in their garden. Right? No, we were just in Oman a little while ago, and we saw men on ladders, and they were putting bags over the date palms. Why were they doing that? Protect from the birds. So the birds would not eat Major Paul's dates. Major Paul, we need to pray for his date addiction, right? So the birds wouldn't eat the dates, right? That's exactly it. Because you don't want birds in your garden; they're going to eat your garden. In verse 3 of this very same chapter in Matthew, Jesus has already described birds who steal the farmer's seed. And not only do gardeners not invite birds into our gardens, we'll do all sorts of crazy things to keep the birds out of our gardens, right? And what do we call this? A scarecrow, because we are hoping it will scare the crows and the birds away, right? Because we don't want birds in our gardens. Or these brightly colored, they call these whirligigs, where you put them in gardens and they spin around with the wind because you don't want because they'll scare away the birds. Or we'll put like nets over our gardens, like the nets over the date trees. We will hang foil or old CDs up in our gardens. I had a friend who used to collect pie tins and used to put tinfoil parts up in their garden. Or these I thought were ingenious. These are bottles that they've made like fins, so they spin around in the air to keep the birds away. Or we will get fake birds that we hope will scare the real birds away. So we'll get like these fake eagles to put in our garden, or the fake owls to put in our gardens, because we don't want birds in our gardens. One day, this is a true story. We had an old red dog, and I read that if you put like dog fur in your garden, it will keep the birds away. So I shaved my poor dog. Is this true, Major Paul? Yes. Not bald, but no, I am not a dog groomer by any means, so this poor dog did not look good. And I'm like some crazy woman out in my garden, like, flea birds, trying to, so now I have vegetables covered with dog hair. It was not a good move, but I wanted to get the birds away. And in this parable that Jesus tells, he tells a story about mustard seeds that turn into trees that welcome birds into gardens. And I think part of the reason that he says this is because God's kingdom is surprising and unexpected. In a world where we're supposed to shut off those who hurt us, Jesus tells us to love our enemies. God's kingdom causes us to do things we wouldn't normally do. The Apostle Paul, he goes one step further, doesn't he, in Romans? He says, but if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. You see, the kingdom of heaven is a place that will grow beyond our expectations and will always, always embrace those who we least expected it to. In the gospel, the kingdom of heaven came to fishermen and prostitutes and tax collectors and children. Remember that story? Jesus is sitting and he's teaching and the kids are coming up to him and the disciples are like, get those kids away. This is adult business. And Jesus says, no. Let the little children come to me. In our world, it might be the poor, the strangers, the foreigners, the folks on the margins of society. That's who the kingdom of heaven goes to. If we plant God's kingdom, You and I cannot predict the pests that will be welcomed there. And Jesus is telling his disciples that his kingdom cannot, indeed, will not be limited. That under its branches there will be women and Gentiles and people of every color speaking in every language. Which brings me to another issue we often have with parables. Sometimes parables, we can be ignorant of the time and the culture from which the parables come. Jesus talked about farmers and servants and wedding banquets. These are the things that his listeners would have been familiar with. Just as people in Jesus' day might have difficulty if we talk to them about tablets or cell phones or social media, we often have difficulty understanding the context of the parables. And this is true of the mustard seed as well, because the listeners of Jesus' day would know that one does not just go out willy-nilly planting mustard seeds. You just don't plant these. In fact, mustard seeds in certain Jewish contexts, it was forbidden to plant them because they grow rapidly and aggressively, and they take over the space that you grow them in. So, for instance, you weren't allowed to plant mustard in your vineyard. Why? Because if you did that, you wouldn't have a vineyard, right? It would take over and you wouldn't be able to get your grapes or your wine. Where I'm from, Jesus might have compared a mustard seed to these guys. These are Bradford pear trees. You don't get any nummy pears off of them, by the way. What happened is in the late 80s and early 90s, when people built their house in the suburbs, they planted these trees because they had these pretty white flowers that smell like fish. I'm not joking with you. And they were like, oh, they're beautiful in the springtime. They stink up the neighborhood, and they thought these would be pretty in the neighborhood. But what happened is these flowers tend to pollinate all the trees around them. And they grow in places that they can't control. And so in the Midwestern states of the United States, if you look in ditches, in meadows, it looks like this, that these Bradford pear trees are taking over. They're what's called an invasive species. And so Jesus might have said, the kingdom of heaven is like some guy who, perhaps not knowingly, plants a Bradford pear in his front yard. And all of a sudden, it takes over the whole neighborhood, right? Or he might have said, the kingdom of heaven is like these guys. This is sumac. Same story. People planted it because it's pretty and red, right? But the problem is that it grows and it takes over the undergrowth of the forests. And when it takes over, little saplings of native trees can't grow there. And so it takes over, and you can see you have this forest up here, but down here, there's no new trees because the sumac has killed them all off. And so Jesus might have said, kingdom of heaven is like sumac. It takes over the forest, and all of a sudden, all you see is nothing but sumac. Or perhaps bamboo. You guys know bamboo, right? Right? In the American South, people are like, oh, this stuff grows fast. We'll just plant it in the front yard. And you don't have a house left, right? Jesus might have said, you know what? The kingdom of heaven is like bamboo or Bradford pears or sumacs. If you plant it, this stuff is going to take over. It's going to be impossible to get rid of. In the same way, God's kingdom will take over. You and I, we can't control God's kingdom once it takes root. On the occasion of the International Day for Children and Youth, I'm reminded that the Salvation Army in the USA started with a 16-year-old girl, Eliza Shirley. She was serving in a Salvation Army in London, England, and her parents were going to move to Philadelphia. So she went to General Booth and she said, General Booth, I'd like to bring the Salvation Army with me to the USA. And General Booth said, no. He did. He said, we don't have enough resources. There's no way we can do that. Are you kidding me? And in fact, he told her, he said, you know what? If you go to the USA, you have broken your covenant. He was pretty mean to poor Eliza Shirley. But she was persistent. She said, no, I have to go. My folks are moving. And he said, well, do what you need to do. I guess if it takes off, we'll send some officers there. Well, you all know what happened, right? It took off. It was like that mustard seed that took over and sprung up all over the place. And Booth had no choice but to send George Scott Railton and others to help the work continue. It's a story, in fact, that happens all over the Salvation Army world, here in the Middle East, right? There were Salvationists meeting, and they said, could we get an officer? And the Army was like, well, there's not a lot of officers. Are you sure about it? And they said, yeah. And here we are. You see, because the kingdom of heaven, we can't control what it does. The kingdom of heaven is of God's design, is from heaven itself. And so when we plant it, it takes over. It does things that we can't predict it to do. Today, the Salvation Army operates in over 130 countries, and we are working on official recognition more than that. And it's because of that heavenly seed which was planted. Of course, all of this is not to say, when you know the mustard seed is a weed and those kind of things, is not to say that the mustard seed is not useful. In the hands of a right cook, mustard is a powerful spice. In fact, I just used some yesterday. It adds punch to dishes and is useful in making dips and pickles. Mustard greens are also edible. More than that, mustard is known for helping to ease a sore throat. Mustard has powerful antibacterial properties. Mustard has been used for everything from achy muscles to giving skin a healthy glow. Not that I have ever put mustard on my face, but apparently you can. Major Paul tells a story about when he was a little boy and he had a cold. His grandmother put on his chest a mustard plaster. And that was supposed to bring out, he said it really just burned and made him miserable, but it was to bring out, he survived, obviously, so it worked, right? That mustard seed, scientists have even experimented with this little mustard seed as a treatment for diabetes and cancer. Which brings up another point about parables. You see, the worst mistake we can make when looking at the parables of Jesus is not to respond to their message at all, to gloss over them like they were nothing but cute stories. Jesus knew that everyone would not understand his parables, not because he was intentionally making them difficult to understand, but because the hearts of his listeners were often closed. We should be careful not to make the same mistake. Just as a wise farmer would know exactly how to handle a mustard seed and where to plant it and how to handle the plants, and a wise cook would know how to use the resulting plants and seeds to feed her family, Jesus, in his wisdom, taught us in parables so that these stories would be useful as we grow in our relationship with him. The biggest mistake we can make is not to listen to and understand God's message for us in the mustard seed. So today I have for each of you a mustard seed. Major Paul? You got a helper. Good. As you examine your mustard seed, it's going to become apparent just how small it is. In fact, I had a big bag of mustard. I used just less than a teaspoon of seeds to make these cards. The phrase, as small as a mustard seed, was probably a common idiom in the time of Jesus. Did you see Miriam's new baby? A little girl as small as a mustard seed. Oh, that's not going to do anything. It's just as small as a mustard seed. It was a way of saying that something was small and perhaps insignificant. For Jesus and his disciples, the kingdom was that little mustard seed. A teacher and his young disciples from Galilee, as small as a mustard seed. Insignificant, unimportant. Sometimes we are tempted to view children and even ourselves in that same way. Oh, the Salvation Army in the Middle East, small as a mustard seed. Yet just as the whole of the Church of God grew and covered the globe from that small mustard seed of the disciples, think of how our world can be transformed by the small mustard seeds just in this room. We come from many places and countries and many different talents and backgrounds. We saw some of those talents displayed today for us, didn't we? The parable of the mustard seed teaches us that small and insignificant as we might be, the kingdom of God within us, growing around us, can do more than you and I could ever imagine. It is God's power that takes that small seed and turns it into a tree that takes over the garden, invites others in. It's God's power that takes that small seed and in faith moves mountains. It's God's power that takes that small seed and allows the impossible to be made possible in our lives.